Morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of COS Live. I'm your host, Rita Peters. I'm the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs with Convention of States Action. And you might be able to see the West Virginia flag just over my shoulder there. That's because in just a few moments, we are expecting a debate and vote of the West Virginia House of Delegates on HJR 31, which is the Article 5 application supported by Convention of States Action. That legislation calls for an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution on just three topics: fiscal restraints, term limits, and limits on federal scope and jurisdiction. Now, 17 states have already passed the identical resolution, and this year it's been introduced by an additional 23 states, including West Virginia. Now, to be clear, this will not be the final vote that you see in the West Virginia House. We still need a vote by the West Virginia Senate in order to make the Mountaineer state number 18 to pass our resolution. We are already halfway to convention, and with West Virginia, we might be more than halfway. So let's talk about how we got here. The West Virginia team has been busy building support across the state and in the legislature. Over 19,000 West Virginians have signed the COS petition. Additionally, a recent scientific survey revealed that 70% of West Virginia voters are in favor of an Article 5 convention to propose constitutional amendments that limit federal spending, limit federal power, and establish term limits for Congress and/or federal judges and bureaucrats. This is exactly what the West Virginia House is about to consider in just a few moments. In the survey that I just mentioned, support for this effort crossed party lines. This is really unusual today, but we showed 76% of Republicans supporting and 65% of Democrats in favor. Now, last month, the West Virginia team packed a hearing room of the West Virginia House Judiciary and gave awesome testimony in favor of our resolution. Only one opponent showed up to testify at that meeting, and that was a paid lobbyist from the ACLU. Now, fast forward to last Friday evening, COS President Mark Meckler appeared before the House Judiciary Committee to give expert testimony. After a series of questions, the committee agreed on a voice vote to advance the resolution to the House floor, which is a huge step for the West Virginia team because we have been stuck in the West Virginia House Judiciary Committee in previous years. We are unstuck and onto the floor in just a few moments. If we have a successful vote today, the next step would be for a resolution to go to the Senate, and that may happen very quickly. West Virginia doesn't have a super long session, and they like to move things along. So stay tuned, watch this debate and vote. It will be interesting, I'm sure. There may be some fireworks. And then I would invite you also to stay tuned after the vote because Regional Director Grant Martin, who is the Regional Director for West Virginia and other states, he's standing by to give us live reaction, and he can give us a little bit of behind the scenes information on just how hard our West Virginia grassroots team has worked to get to this point. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in West Virginia today. I don't know if you all know, but I am a West Virginia Mountaineer. I went to high school in West Virginia and got my undergraduate degree from West Virginia University. So I am just going to say, let's go Mountaineers today. Let's get this done in West Virginia. I want to see West Virginia become state number 18 on our way to the 34 states we need to get to convention. So I'm going to pause here and let's listen into the House chamber, see where they are on the agenda, and we expect our resolution to be up very soon. Again, it's HCR 31. Let's see what happens.
that the Senate requiring County Board of Education make meetings available to public in person and through internet, and reports the same back with amendment with the recommendation that it do pass as amended.
Report to be received.
Your Committee on the Judiciary has had under consideration committee substitute for Senate Bill 694 relating to oil and gas conservation, and reports the same back with the recommendation that it do pass.
Report to be received.
Your Committee on Government Organization has had under consideration Senate Bill 213 establishing licensed professional counseling compact, committee substitute for Senate Bill 330 authorizing DOT to promulgate legislative rules, and committee substitute for Senate Bill 522 combining offices of West Virginia State Americans with Disabilities Act and West Virginia Equal Employment Opportunity, and reports the same back with the recommendation that they each do pass.
Report to be received.
Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under consideration committee substitute for Senate Bill 274 requiring Secretary of DHHR to allocate CPS workers by Bureau of Social Services District annually, and report the same back with amendment with recommendation that it do pass as amended.
The report to be received.
Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under consideration committee substitute for Senate Bill 647 prohibiting discrimination in organ donation process, and reports the same back with amendment with recommendation that it do pass as amended, but that it first be referred to the Committee on the Judiciary.
The report will be received, and that bill will be referred to the Committee on Judiciary.
Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under consideration Senate Bill 703 relating to controlled substances schedule, and reports the same back with recommendation that it do pass, but that it first be referred to the Committee on the Judiciary.
The report will be received, and the bill will be referred to the Committee on Judiciary.
Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under consideration Senate Bill 603 prohibiting licensure and relicensure in West Virginia if applicant is prohibited from practicing in another jurisdiction, and reports the same back with the recommendation that it do pass.
That report will be received.
Your Committee on Health and Human Resources has had under consideration committee substitute for Senate Bill.
So as you can see, the West Virginia House session is in progress as we speak. And right now they are doing some housekeeping tasks. They are receiving reports from legislative committees. And for those of you who may be new to the process, that is the way that bills go through the legislature. The bill is introduced, it gets assigned to a committee, and the committee meets, debates about the bill, takes a vote, and then typically makes a recommendation to the full House whether to adopt the bill or not. And then it's at that stage that the House will have debate and do its own vote on the bill, assuming the committee reports it favorably. So that's where we are in West Virginia with House Concurrent Resolution 31. That's HCR 31, our Convention of States resolution. We got through the House Judiciary Committee late Friday evening as Mark Meckler was there to give expert testimony and answer questions. The House Judiciary Committee recommended that this resolution be adopted by the full House. And it will be any minute now that we will be getting our debate and vote by the full West Virginia House of Delegates. If the West Virginia House votes favorably on HCR 31, then the next step will be it will go to the Senate for a vote by the Senate, and that could happen very quickly. We don't know the exact timing yet, but stay tuned. So we're going to just go back to the House floor session because we don't want to miss it when our resolution comes up. We're just going to let you watch this process unfold. But again, we do expect them to do some housekeeping work and then possibly take up a few memorial resolutions, which are more formalities that should go pretty quickly. And we hope to be up before long. So stay tuned again after the vote, and we will have live reaction from COS Regional Director Grant Martin. Now back to the West Virginia House floor session.
updating laws on licensure and regulation of money transmitters, and committee substitute for Senate Bill 593, allowing Marshall University's Forensic Analysis Laboratory access and participation in West Virginia DNA database for certain purposes, and reports the same back with the recommendation that they each do pass.
That report will be received. Further standing committee reports, select committee reports, executive messages, Senate messages.
The clerk of the Senate announces that the Senate has adopted without amendment House Concurrent Resolution 23, requesting the Division of Highways to place at least 10 additional signs along highways entering West Virginia honoring fallen veterans and Gold Star families.
Message be received.
The clerk of the Senate announces that the Senate has passed the following bills. Senate Bill 715, decreasing and increasing existing items of appropriation from State Fund General Revenue.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 716, supplementing appropriation to DOE, West Virginia Board of Education, Strategic Staff Development.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 717, supplemental appropriation to miscellaneous boards and commissions, Board of Medicine, Medical Licensing Board.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 718, supplemental appropriation to Department of Administration Travel Management Aviation Fund.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 719, supplemental appropriation to DHS Fire Commission Fire Marshal fees.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 720, supplementing and amending appropriations to Executive Governor's Office Civil Contingent Fund.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 722, expiring funds to DEP Division of Environmental Protection, Reclamation of Abandoned and Dilapidated Property Program Fund.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 723, making supplementary appropriation to Department of Agriculture, West Virginia Spay-Neuter Assistance Fund.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 724, making supplementary appropriation to DHS Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Regional Jail and Correctional Facility Authority.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Senate Bill 725, supplementing and amending appropriations to DHS, West Virginia State Police.
Message be received. The bill will be referred to the Committee on Finance.
Clerk of the Senate announces that the Senate has adopted Senate Concurrent Resolution 49, establishing honor guard in each National Guard unit.
The message be received. The resolution will be referred to the Committee on Rules. Are there further Senate messages? If not, resolutions.
House Concurrent Resolution 97, U.S. Army Air Corps Private Albert J. Sutphen Memorial Highway.
The resolution will be referred to the Committee on Rules. Petitions, motions, bills introduced, unfinished business.
Committee substitute for Senate Concurrent Resolution 11, Dennis E. Davis Veterans Nursing Home.
The question before the House is the adoption of the resolution just read by the clerk. Committee substitute for Senate Concurrent Resolution 11. Is there debate on this resolution? If not, those in favor of adoption of this naming resolution will please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. Chair declares that naming resolution adopted. The clerk will please communicate the action of the House to the Senate. Chair notes on the agenda we have 4 additional infrastructure naming resolutions on for consideration today. Are there objections to consideration of these resolutions en masse? If not, the Chair will read those 4 infrastructure naming resolutions.
Committee substitute for Senate Concurrent Resolution 13, U.S. Army Private First Class Joseph Stanley McKinney Memorial Bridge. Senate Concurrent Resolution 23, U.S. Marine Corps Corporal Guy Maywood Edwards Memorial Bridge. House Concurrent Resolution 95, Clemmer Brothers World War II Veterans Memorial Bridge. House Concurrent Resolution 96, U.S. Air Force Captain Perry Thomas Rose Memorial Road.
The question now before the House is the adoption of those 4 naming resolutions just read by the clerk. Is there discussion on any of those 4 resolutions? If not, those in favor of adoption of those 4 resolutions read by the clerk will please say aye. Those opposed will please say no. The ayes have it. The Chair declares the motion adopted. Those 4 naming resolutions have been adopted by the House. The clerk will please communicate the action of the House to the Senate. Next resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 31, applying to the Congress of the United States to call a convention of states.
The question now before the House is the adoption of House Concurrent Resolution 31. This is a debatable question. Is there debate on the resolution? The gentleman at 36, Doug Pritz, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution. What this resolution does is it allows us to apply for a convention in which West Virginia would have a say in constitutional amendments. And these constitutional amendments would relate to putting restraints on the federal government, term limits, and putting fiscal restraints on the federal government. There's several reasons why I rise in support of this resolution. This is perhaps one of the most important votes we will take as legislators. We have an out-of-control federal government. We have a bureaucracy that routinely acts contrary to the interests of the American people. We have an expanding bureaucracy. We have politicians in Washington that serve basically as long as they want to. And for these reasons and many others, we need to put some brakes on the power and authority of the federal government. Now, one point I want to make is one of the reasons why we need to put restraints on the power and authority of the federal government when it comes to the decisions that they make. Now, one of the most significant provisions of the U.S. Constitution is the Commerce Clause. Now, this is perhaps the one part of the U.S. Constitution that has been abused the most. The Commerce Clause has been expanded to such an extent that there are basically no limits on what the federal government can do for all practical purposes. One case that I will reference is one that came up during the Depression. During the Great Depression, there was the case of Filburn, Wicker v. Filburn. And in this case, essentially what happened is the Roosevelt administration and Congress pushed through what was known as the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And as part of this act, essentially what the federal government did is they put limits on how much wheat a person could actually be produced. Now, a guy by the name of Filburn, he challenged this law. And as part of the challenge to this law, he said, look, there's no reason to be putting any limits on how much wheat I produce because a lot of the wheat that I'm going to be producing, I'm going to be using for personal use. He challenged this law. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And you know what the U.S. Supreme Court said? They interpreted the Commerce Clause in such a way that it was interpreted beyond recognition. Essentially, they said that, yes, the federal government could actually regulate how much wheat a person could use for their own personal use. That was an abuse of the power of the federal government. That was far beyond what the framers intended whenever they pushed through and enacted the Constitution of the United States. That's just one example. A more recent example was an expansive view that was taken over the Commerce Clause so that the federal government could claim, and they actually did this, they said, based on the Commerce Clause, you have to buy health insurance. That's how they've interpreted the Commerce Clause. It's gone so beyond what the framers intended that it's beyond recognition. The other thing that this convention calls for is term limits. Well, a lot of people ask, well, don't we have term limits? Isn't that elections? Well, if you look at the statistics, a person's chances of being reelected to Congress is close to 100%. Close to 100%. Those are the chances that somebody's going to be reelected. And what happens is many individuals that end up going to Congress, they just stay there forever and they don't do anything. They do nothing. They don't do anything to limit the power and authority of the federal government. They don't put fiscal restraints on how much we're spending. And that's the other thing that we need to be addressing. And that's the other thing that this proposed resolution does. It puts restraints on how much we are spending. It allows us to propose an amendment to the Constitution that will put actual restraints on how much we are spending. Right now, the federal budget is such that 9% of everything we spend goes towards financing our debt. That's going to continue going into the future if we don't do something. The folks in Washington have done nothing to put a curb on spending. They haven't done anything, and they've just borrowed and borrowed against our children. And we have to put a limitation on this. So those are the main reasons why we need to pass this resolution. It's about putting restraints on the federal government. And I'll say this: one of the arguments that I've heard against this is the idea that, well, we shouldn't be going in, we shouldn't be tampering with the Constitution. Well, you know what? The Supreme Court has interpreted our Constitution in ways that the founders never would have imagined. Would the founders have imagined Roe v. Wade? Would the founders have imagined that the Commerce Clause would be interpreted in such a way that there are basically no limits to it? That's not what was intended. This is our chance to put a proper check on the power and authority of the federal government. And the other concern that I've heard about this proposed convention is the idea that there aren't going to be any kind of proper checks on it. Well, there are proper checks on it. The proper check is the people of West Virginia and all the other states out there that have shared values with us. And I just want to be clear with this. For any kind of amendment that gets through this convention to be passed, it has to be approved by 3/4 of the states. So that means a majority of states that are similarly situated and have similar values to West Virginia are going to have to approve any kind of amendments. 3/4. That means the vast majority of the states that voted for Donald Trump would have to approve of any kind of proposed amendments. That's a sufficient check. And if beyond that, the other check that we have is the fact that the call of what this convention would be all about is right in front of you. The purpose of this proposed convention is to impose fiscal restraints, limit the power and authority and jurisdiction of the federal government, and to impose term limits. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation. Right now, we are at 17 states. 17 states out there have already passed this. If we pass this, we're going to be the 18th state. So this is our chance to send a message to Congress and the federal government and the special interests in Washington that we are going to be running the show when it comes to our Constitution and how it's to be interpreted. This is not about changing the Constitution. This is not about tampering with it. This is about restoring the Constitution to what the founders intended. For these reasons, I urge support for the resolution.
Gentleman 36, second row is recognized.
Would the gentleman answer a question?
Of course.
Does the word secret appear in the resolution? Anything to ban secrecy of the convention? Or maybe anything that requires the convention to be open to the public? I've looked and I don't see it. I've tried to find it.
I don't recall reviewing the word secret in the body
Okay.
of the text.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to address the resolution. Let me point the members out that on page 3, line 47 and 48, it says this: Congress does not have the power of authority to determine any rules for governing of an amendment constitution of the states called pursuant to Article 5 of the United States Constitution. Any rule. Well, let's go to the only time we ever had a convention. Where was that? That was in Philadelphia, and it was called to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation. But what happened? 4 months of secrecy until September 17th. What do we get? We got a new constitution based on the Commerce Clause, because Alexander Hamilton wanted a national economy, and he knew that if we had 13 Balkan states, Balkan-like states, we would never have a national economy because they were setting up special taxes. They weren't collecting debts that are owed to out-of-state people. There were all kinds of problems. And then, of course, Shays' Rebellion happens, and they realize we don't have any kind of standing military. And the only thing that saved Massachusetts and the country from Shays' Rebellion was that the Massachusetts militia was able to overcome them. All right. Secret. That's the one problem. We've seen lots of configurations of this resolution, and they've never admitted that the Constitution in Philadelphia was secret. Nor can they, because they also have to concede that the convention in Philadelphia rewrote and set aside the Articles of Confederation. This is a precedent unlike any we can ever know. This attacks the basic foundations of our rule of law as we know them, and as we have been successful to become the most powerful country in the world. And it's based on the Commerce Clause and having a national economy. Now, that's how we got to where we are. It may not be nirvana for where we'd like to be someday, but let me point out that a secret convention, what would happen? They would announce what their amendments are, and it would change the political paradigm and attack the rule of law of what we have right now. And in each legislature, you would have consideration of basic rights, and I think including the Bill of Rights. Now, I know it has a reference to the Bill of Rights, but the secret is this. Okay, fiscal restraints, balanced by, I don't know, whatever. And also term limits on everybody. The Supreme Court, anybody that we want a term limit. And it's not just related to elected officials. It's to bureaucrats or anybody else. We can put a term limit on the Secretary of Commerce. The one that matters is this one. That would limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. What kind of country are we going to have if we don't have primacy by the federal government? Now, they do things that I'm not happy about, and they do things that you're not happy about. But it's the way we do them. It's the American way. It's 200 and some years of amending the Constitution to make it work. So we're going to authorize some folks to go someplace, and Congress cannot force it to be an open convention. Please remember that. And anytime you talk to somebody, you need to say, if it's a secret convention, I don't care. It's okay. But you're not going to do it because it's not true. Everybody is frightened to death of a secret convention. And when you limit the jurisdiction and power of the federal government, what happens to the Bill of Rights? Now, we probably won't amend that exactly, but there's no question that we're establishing states' rights. That's why we fought the Civil War, was over states' rights. You'd think that in our history, 100 and some years ago, we put states' rights aside and made it very clear that whenever we addressed the United States of America, we used plural before the Civil War. We would say the United States of America are, and after the Civil War, we said the United States of America is. Because we're one nation. We're not Balkan states. We're not a bunch of collection of states and states' rights voting and deciding what they want to do, what tax they want to pay and what tax they don't want to pay. All those issues arise. And I think we've got a plate full of issues right now in terms of just dealing with the Ukraine, dealing with Russia, dealing with all kinds of domestic issues that we've got in terms of disease and the economy and trying to get everything back and going. But what this will do, this will plop down a political paradigm that will be the discussion in America, and it will all be an attack on the Constitution that we know and that we have carved out of our history for 200 and some years. The power and jurisdiction of the federal government will be limited. You go, well, what do you mean? There's no limitations on what the limitations will be. We're just stuck. Now, some folks will say, well, but Larry, the states have to ratify it. Yeah, what, did they go up or down? Are the states going to be able to pick between amendments as we do today? Is that flexibility going to be available? Remember, Congress cannot specify any rule of the convention whatsoever. How we elect speakers, how we elect whoever's going to be the head of the convention, whether there's, any of those issues are wide open and available for mischief. For mischief. Unlike any other mischief that has ever been possible in the history of our Constitution. This opens it all up. And we'll be having people standing around in court saying, when it said that the power of the federal government is subject to the power of each state, the states get to interpret the Bill of Rights. The 14th Amendment that guarantees every citizen the right equal to every other citizen's right. Well, that's federal government. The Constitution of States says that we're going to limit that. So, we're going to be arguing about everything. And the point is we're going to crack the foundation of this country. We're going to put big cracks in the foundation of this country. And you say, well, but we don't want Congress messing with this. Why is secrecy not mentioned in the resolution? They want you to vote for it because they want it to be secret. There is no explanation for why, whenever we put in there that Congress can't mess with the rules, that we don't say, except that the convention shall be open and available. It's intentional. It's not an accident. Oh gosh, we left secrecy out of the resolution. Are you really going to vote for secrecy to challenge the very foundation of this country? That could go in there. But every time we get a new configuration of this resolution, it never mentions that. And it never takes us back to Philadelphia because legal precedent, and this we got from England many, many centuries ago, that we do the way we did it before. So how are we going to do it? We're going to do what we did in Philadelphia, and when we talk about amendments, we'll just do one great big strike and insert amendment, and the Constitution's gone. And we'll write it the way we want to. Never, never has this Constitution been challenged as it is in this resolution and in this way. We are on the precipice of an abyss that we will regret forever. We have a duty to protect, our oath says it, the Constitution of the United States, and to have amendments that could be on anything that, I'm trying to think what the power and jurisdiction of the federal government would be, what kind of, putting limits on that. What is there that you couldn't tuck under that idea to limit the federal government, to make states primary? I don't think you can come up with much that you couldn't fit under limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Look, the problems we have today are not the same problems we have in 20 years. They're not the same problems we had 40 years ago. We've survived the Cold War. There are all kinds of eras in America, in American constitutional law, but this one takes it all and throws it in the can. It eliminates the Constitution we have and that we've known and that we've relied on. And how many times have we in our political life thought, thank goodness there's a Constitution, there is a court that can review this, there is some way to make decisions that is in an orderly rule of law way. The essential ingredient of American society and success is our respect for rule of law. What law? Our law comes from the Constitution. An amazing document. Every time we pledge allegiance, we ought to be thanking the folks who came up with the idea. Probably the first major country to adopt a republic since Julius Caesar overturned the Republic of Rome. Oh, there were some nation states that did it, but nobody big until we came along. And there's a reason for that. Our success is based on rule of law and respect for the rule of law and the structure for our decision-making that's set out in the Constitution. And to go in and just sweep away, the only way that the Second Amendment to the Constitution as we know it today can ever be gotten rid of is through a convention just like this. And if you think you're voting to protect the Second Amendment by authorizing this resolution, I think you're making a serious mistake. The Second Amendment is as secure in our Constitution and in our way of life as any amendment could ever possibly be. Anything that limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is not going to help us. And anything that allows attacks on the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, are dangerous. Because we ought to do it as we've always done it before. Our amendments have always been voted by Congress, one idea at a time, and accepted or rejected by the states. That's the way it should be. That's the way it is. That's the way it must be. You cannot vote for this resolution and have any security in rule of law in America. You cannot. This will absolutely crack the foundations of our democracy. I sincerely request each member to vote against this resolution and contemplate what it does and what it can do to the foundations of America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman 16th, Doug Linville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I thought a lot about whether or not I would even speak on this, but let me say this. We have a constitutional convention every time that a Supreme Court justice is nominated to the court. Every single time. Antonin Scalia, prior to his death, discussed how there was always such a fight after he had been appointed to the court and confirmed in confirmations. And if you'll recall, not too long ago, they were going back through somebody's calendar, a nominee's calendar, now Justice of the Supreme Court's calendar from when he was 16 years old. The man kept his calendars. He wrote down just about everything he did. Now, there's an additional nominee to the court, and they're trying to do the same thing. Why? Because every time that you nominate someone to the Supreme Court of the United States, it essentially amounts to a constitutional convention. What is it that they're going to say? And that's the words of Antonin Scalia, by the way. This living, breathing Constitution fallacy has meant that whatever the whims or wills of a particular justice of the Supreme Court are now going to be what the Constitution says. A convention of the states can fix that. It can fix that. It can more clearly define what it is that the Constitution says. And I think that's eminently desirable. Nominees to the court used to be nearly unanimously confirmed. Then you had Bork, you had several others. We're about to see that exact process take place once again in Washington regarding the newest nominee to the Supreme Court. And why does it have to be that way? Well, it shouldn't. But interestingly, when you're asking someone about how they would interpret the law or interpret the Constitution, if it's a judge, they have to be very careful about how they answer. And so there's a lot of questions that you have, right? And they can't very often give you a direct answer. So maybe that should stop. If you all will remember, just 2 years ago, there was talk about adding new justices to the court because people were not happy about the current potential interpretations of cases. They were worried about stare decisis. They were worried about all these sorts of things. Now, I don't see anyone saying that, well, you know, maybe we just shouldn't put anybody else on the court. Maybe just as justices, you know, pass away or retire, that it should end. Those amount to many constitutional conventions, but with a whole lot of ambiguity as to what it is that they will interpret. This process involves any number of states having to go to a convention, propose these, and then coming back to all of us with these amendments and coming back to the people. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's very, very simple. Should we try to amend the Constitution by packing the United States Supreme Court, by adding justices? Probably not. But some of the very same...
Gentlemen, take the point.
Yes, he's talking about a whole different process. He's not talking about the resolution. We're talking about this Constitutional Convention, Article 5. He's talking about something that's outlined in the Constitution about how to pick a Supreme Court justice.
He is. This is a good time to put some ground rules on this debate. So Gemma will sustain the point of order. Gemma will rule the point of order as well taken. The chair will also note that we do have several speakers who wish to address this topic. So the chair will permit debate on the structure of the Constitution to the extent it's relevant to the members' consideration of the decisions about your vote on this resolution, but the chair will not entertain a discussion about the Constitution in general. So to the extent that all members who wish to be recognized need to discuss any provisions of the current United States Constitution in your debates on this resolution, that's permissible, but that's all that's permissible. So with that in mind, June 16th is recognized to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Constitution does not require that there be only 9 justices on the Supreme Court of the United States. But you want to know what could? An amendment to that Constitution using an Article 5 convention, much like we have before us right now. The debate here has went along the lines of, my goodness, what else could happen? And I would argue that as new members are added to the court, that exact same debate happens. And yet, we don't seem to oppose just generally adding anyone there. Mr. Speaker, I think that the Constitution has been interpreted in different ways under different justices of the United States Supreme Court. I think that an Article 5 convention has the opportunity to more clearly define what the Constitution is, what it means, what it says, and whether or not you're a textualist. It could even go into saying, hey, this is what the text of the Constitution says, and we want to limit the interpretation thereof to what it meant at the time it was ratified. That is exactly the point here. That is exactly the point here. We argue the Constitution in this building all the time. Whether a bill is constitutional, whether it's presumed constitutional, I would argue to you, Mr. Speaker, that an Article 5 convention is well-founded and that there are sufficient protections in place that any amendments to the United States Constitution must be overwhelmingly passed by red and blue states prior to its adoption. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of the resolution.
The gentleman with 67th, Doyle, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Early on in the debate here, we heard the phrase that the federal government is out of control. Every moment of our nation's history, a significant portion of the population has believed that the federal government was out of control. That's a matter of opinion. I would suggest to the members that before we adopt something like this, that everybody read a book called The Quartet by a gentleman named Joseph Ellis. It is the story of how the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia came to be. 4 people, George Washington, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams, agreed that the Articles of Confederation weren't working and needed to be replaced. And it was, in fact, a cabal on their part that hornswoggled the Continental Congress of the time into calling a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. And under the direction of those 4 outstanding people, that Constitutional Convention came up with, I think, as fine a government document as has ever been written in the history of this planet. We lucked out. Now, there are 2 ways of amending the Constitution. Every single amendment that's been suggested on the floor so far can be done in the normal way. Congress passes it, the states ratify. I think the Article 5 convention was put there as sort of a doomsday device in case there was a really, really serious threat to the Republic. And by the way, There are many constitutional scholars that believe because the original convention was called to amend the Articles, there is no way that any instructions can bind an Article 5 convention to whatever it was sent there to do. Once it's assembled, I believe it could totally amend the Constitution, throw it out, just like the original one did the Articles of Confederation. And many constitutional scholars believe there would not be an obligation to report the product to the states for ratification. Now, in the case of the original Constitutional Convention, the framers decided they ought to report it to the states to be ratified. And they agreed it was kind of an arbitrary decision that when 3/4 of them ratified, we'd have a constitution. But that doesn't necessarily apply for this new Article 5 convention. So I would suggest this is a very dangerous move and we should not do it. Let's vote this down. Thank you.
The gentleman 42nd, Longenecker is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference between that very famous convention that was spoken about by two of my friends here, it actually brought about a good thing for our country. And what has happened since then that they did not have at that time is represented by this folded flag that I keep on my desk. 13 folds. It has a significant meaning. The blue field that has the show when it's folded has a significant meaning. And it's usually presented to families who've lost people who died for principles that were brought about by that first convention. Chiefly our Bill of Rights. The right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, due process, the right to be armed to protect yourself and your family. I am confident that if we have a convention, folks, which is simply a meeting of the states, a meeting of we the people, across the 50 states that this flag represents, we the people can get together and say, you know what? Some of the arguments that were made here are absolutely right. There is a purpose. There was a doomsday clause written into that Constitution. Folks, I speak on behalf of many of my constituents in my district who believe that we are on the verge of a doomsday for our country right now. We have a federal debt approaching $30 trillion. We have a border, federal laws that this federal government refuses to enforce, which are bringing millions of people into our country at taxpayers' expense, which will further add to that incredible debt that cannot last. So, is doomsday going to happen tomorrow? I don't know. Will it happen next week? I have no clue. But my constituents want safeguards and guardrails in place, and the only way we can ever address what's happening in Washington, D.C. as a state is to assign delegates to get to this convention and have these discussions for we the people. Period. I urge adoption of this resolution. Thank you.
Gentleman 51st, Williams is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the delegate from the 67th for stealing a little bit of my thunder, but I'll try to make some original points today. I want to talk a little bit, not so much about the process of the Constitutional Convention. I don't think that it is a terribly bad idea. I would regard it as a doomsday advice, but my concern with the convention is, at this point in time in our country, is now the time. The first convention was attended by George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton. Who among us in political life rises to that level? Nobody's going to write a musical about anybody in political life in 200 years like they did Hamilton. There's no one as thoughtful and as bright, and I just fear that there are such fissures in our country right now, such divides, that if we had a constitutional convention at this moment in time, you would get nothing but bad faith arguments based upon uninformed opinions. This is not the time. Maybe someday it would be the time, but now is not doomsday. The people in the first convention were brought together by a despotic king thousands of miles away who was taxing them without representation, quartering troops in their houses. There's not a circumstance that rises to anything near that level at this point in time. This will turn into nothing more than a partisan, runaway convention, the effects of which we might not be able to even fathom. I urge rejection. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman in the 55th, Doug Ward, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friend from the 36th would have you believe that this is going to be an exercise in secrecy, that we have no idea where this would go. Let's take him at his word and just concede that, you know, it rolls out the way that he's suggesting it would. Not a thing in this convention would pass were it not brought back to the states where there is no secrecy. Everything that we do is televised. Everything that we do is recorded. 3/4 of the states would have to ratify anything that came out of this convention. My friend from the 67th made a comment that every amendment proposed by this application can be done now in the normal way. Who in this body suggests that the normal way is going to happen? Who thinks that the federal government, the Congress, is going to police itself? I was born in 1965, and at that time we had roughly $300 million in national debt. It's hard for me to be optimistic that my 17-year-old daughter will ever grow up in a country where we can proclaim that we're a strong, safe country. Because as it was mentioned by one of the delegates, almost 10% of what we spend now as taxpayers goes just to service the national debt. What happens when it becomes 20 or 30? I'm fired up. It terrifies me that we're on this path. I cannot predict what would happen in an Article 5 convention. And I know that folks that have looked to me as a representative of or been called a constitutional sheriff or a constitutional person that you know takes pride in our Constitution. I'll never, and nobody in this room, as mentioned, will ever have the statesmanship and the gift from God to be able to predict, you know, how we as humans would be able to govern ourselves. But I do know that if we don't do something, the nirvana that you spoke of, though it's unachievable, will continue in the opposite direction until the states take the power that they have. I urge adoption of this amendment.
Lady in the 51st, Doug Fleshauer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge rejection of this amendment for reasons, some of which have been spoken. I'd like to remind everybody a little bit about history, and I had to look it up. The Articles of Convention were totally thrown out. That is the only precedent we have. So many people have already stated that there is no right of anyone to control the rules of that convention. But after we adopted our Constitution, we adopted a number of amendments, including the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the Third Amendment and the first 10 amendments, which were called the Bill of Rights. And we used the process in the Constitution to adopt those amendments after the Constitutional Convention, at which the only precedent we have was set that said that you can throw out everything that you had before. So there are no restraints. There are no limitations, and I'd like to read, and I am somebody who has studied the Constitution and who loves our Constitution. I think that is something that most everyone in this room shares. And I just want to read something that was written by one of our Supreme Court justices who was given the opportunity to interpret the Constitution. Chief Justice Warren Burger, who was appointed by Republican Richard Nixon, said, "There is no way to effectively limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one amendment or one issue, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda." We don't know if they'll keep the 3/4 rule. We don't know what will happen to interests of West Virginia. We are a small state, and we could be affected in negative ways by the Constitutional Convention because we don't have the population. In fact, we are losing population as we speak. People are voting with their feet and leaving. So just because we do this doesn't mean that the issues that some of you believe in or that I believe in are going to get into that document. So I would recommend that we reject this, use our normal process. I remember when 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. That is a relatively recent amendment. The amendment process can work and does work, and I think that it's important that this document, which I consider sacred, that we take it very, very seriously if we're going to change it. So I recommend rejection of the resolution.
Gentleman the third, Dr. Fluharty is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to channel my inner gentleman from the 32nd. Another Article 5 resolution. Another Article 5 resolution. Year after year, people embark on this legislature, and I know they love the Constitution. They love the Constitution. So much so they usually put it on their ties as they walk around these halls. They love it. I mean, I don't know why we keep wasting such precious legislative time on this. Year after year, we get these speeches that say this is the most important vote, and then we vote on it the very next year. I'm eager for this special meeting we may have. If you think this is just a meeting, I suppose you think January 6th was just a tourist event. Give me a break. We've never had an Article 5 convention. The closest we came was 1983. We were 2 states shy. What did Congress do that year? They went in, introduced 41 bills related to it. Many of those bills related to how the delegation would be selected and be based on population. So if you think West Virginia is going to have equal representation, good luck. Congress is going to dominate you. You're giving more power to Congress. You don't think they're going to get ready for this? Give me a break. You're not going to bypass Congress. You're simply asking them to call the convention. You know, I don't get it, guys. I'm tired of the emails, so maybe we should just light this board green, send it on its way, and call it a day. That'd be great. But no, we'll be back again, and you know this. Let's just quit wasting precious legislative time. Let's move on, get something done that actually helps West Virginians, and not keep pushing this political fetish every year that you guys love so much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman the 45th, Douglas Martin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the previous question.
Okay, the gentleman the 45th moves the previous question on the resolution. Is the demand for the previous question sustained? Okay, the demand is sustained. The question is, shall the previous question be ordered on the resolution? Those in favor of ordering the previous question on the resolution will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. Roll call vote is demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question is, shall the previous question on House Concurrent Resolution 31 be ordered? Those in favor of ordering the previous question on House Concurrent Resolution 31 will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result on this question. There are 22 ayes, 72 nays, and 6 members absent. Less than a majority in the affirmative. The chair declares the motion for the previous question rejected. The previous question is not ordered. Gentleman, 32nd, Douglas Fast is recognized on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not exactly sure what the previous speaker was referring to, but it's been implied and actually explicitly stated that in such a convention, an Article 5 convention, that it could nullify the entire Constitution. Do you think, ladies and gentlemen, that if that were the product of such a convention, that 38 states would actually vote to ratify such a decision by a convention? No way. No way. Nevertheless, speaking of the document that is now before us, this Article 30, this Resolution 31, number 1, impose physical restraints on the federal government. Number 2, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Number 3, limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. Very, very specific. In addition, a lot of discussion has taken place regarding the Bill of Rights. What does this resolution say specifically? An amendment that in any way seeks to amend, modify, or repeal any provision of the Bill of Rights shall not be authorized for consideration at any stage. This application shall be void ab initio. That means void from the beginning, if it ever used at any stage to consider any change to the provision of the Bill of Rights. In addition, safeguards. It's been stated that there are no safeguards. That is absolutely false. Just read the document. Number 7, the West Virginia legislature may provide further instruction to its delegates and may recall its delegates at any time for a breach of a duty or a violation of the instructions. Any time. That's us, ladies and gentlemen. The legislature has the power at any time to recall its delegates. That means they're not participating anymore. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, the Constitution that I believe we all agree is a sacred document and a good document. But you know what's in that document? Article 5. The wisdom of the founders who created this document that we all say is grand and got us here this far. The wisdom was to put in it Article 5. And folks, desperate times call for desperate measures. It's been mentioned, nearing $30 trillion in debt. We are on a path of unsustainability. We are on a path of unsustainability. If we want this republic to last, it calls for desperate measures. And I agree, this is a desperate measure, and it's not something you want to do every other year. And we've not done it since the beginning of this country. But here we are. If we want this country to ever survive, this is a desperate measure that I believe we have to take. We have to do this. I would urge passage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, the 50th, Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very briefly, I just find it ironic, but not surprising, that the gentleman from the 45th and those 22 other members who voted to squash debate appear to be the most ardent supporters of this convention. I think that tells you all you need to know. Thank you.
The gentleman, the 2nd, Douglas DeCerio, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My vote did not register when the question was called on the last vote, and I voted in the red.
Yes, the chair will ask the clerk to record the gentleman's vote as having voted in the negative on the question.
Thank you.
The gentleman 37, Doug Pushkin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman from the 36 who's in support of this resolution please yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm reading the resolution and in the whereas section, giving the reasons why we would be doing something like this. On line 8, whereas the concentration of power at the federal level has had the effect of making federal officials less responsive to the will of the people. I agree with that. And more readily influenced by lobbyists. I agree with that. And wealthy corporations. I agree with that. And special interests in Washington, D.C. I agree with that as well. How would this alleviate that problem? How would that address the issue of the money's influence on politics?
Okay, this is how it works with regulations. What typically happens with regulations is that the federal government is completely uncontrolled in terms of how a statute generally operates. So let's say you take any general statute that's applicable. What typically happens is that statute, for example, let's say the EPA, it's so broadly worded and it's structured in such a way such that there's basically no limits. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, right now, West Virginia is arguing in the United States Supreme Court about excessive authority that has been taken by the executive branch of government. So what happens is, whenever these regulations come out, these individuals they hire their special interests, they hire the lobbyists on, and they make the case to the federal government. So, for example, I'll just take this. The Obama administration comes in. After the Obama administration comes in, they use a statute to greatly expand the power and authority of the federal government. Now, that federal government, they're interpreting and applying the law in a way that was never intended. It was never intended to be applied that way. But the special interests, they help elect individuals into the federal government who control the presidency, and at that point they change the regulations. What this does, if we take away the ability of the federal government to have this broad sweeping power in terms of how they interpret regulations, we limit that. We limit their ability to do that. So that's what happens here. The federal government, through the executive, is beholden to the special interests, and they're not accountable to the people. The people are represented through Congress.
What would keep... That didn't answer the question. I appreciate the...
Yes, it did.
No, well, what would keep money from influencing this whole process to begin with?
Oh, are you talking about... I don't think I understand the question.
Okay, well, thank you for yielding. I'll explain. Thanks for yielding. Well, I agree with a lot of the findings in this, a lot of the reasons for it. And I think one of the biggest reasons is right there, that the problem we have was with money's influence on politics, and none of this will address that. None of this will address, unless it was just to overturn Citizens United, but that's not what we're talking about here. But I guess it could. It could overturn Citizens United, but I don't think that that's what you're going to have with the money that goes into influencing the folks who would be sent to the convention, that would be used to influence the states once it's brought back to ratify. The problem is just the amount of money that is spent on influencing decisions that are made here, on decisions that are made on the other side of the building, and in the huge amounts of money that are used to influence decisions on a congressional level. None of this will address that, and I know that because most of the money I've seen spent in this state has been spent to get us to vote for this. If you look up the reports, the expenditure reports on groups like U.S. term limits and other Article 5 groups, they spend more than anybody else in some of our races. They have so much money. They spent money sending out postcards in my district when I was unopposed. That's stupid money. Stupid money. That's how much they spend. Fly people all around the country, fly the CEO of Parler around the different state legislatures to testify on this. Why is there so much money involved in this? Because that's who's going to have the influence if this horrible idea ever comes to fruition I would just hope that the rest of the states that haven't ratified this are a little more sensible than we're about to be.
Question again is on the adoption of House Concurrent Resolution 31. Are there other members who wish to speak on the resolution? Chairman 36, Doug Rose, recognized for a second recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I tried to take notes on some of the comments, and I truly appreciate how deeply people feel about this and how concerned they are. I certainly have the same feelings and concerns. I just, you know, I don't know. I just can't imagine challenging the Constitution in this way, and it's something I've lived with. I'm an attorney. It's something that I'm so happy to live in the United States of America and not in other countries where they just can't get the rule of law right. In regard to debt, I would say this. I'm also concerned there, but please know that Bill Clinton balanced the budget. And so when we say that this structure of government cannot possibly balance the budget, Bill Clinton did it at a time when we thought it could not be done. So it can be done, and it's going to take some work to do. I would point out that one of the largest congressional grants is the infrastructure bill. I haven't talked to anybody that's not really excited about it, and it was bipartisan as far as I know. In terms of rules of the convention, that's the scary part, folks. It can be in secret, and also the Congress cannot tell the convention that they have to propose separate amendments to be ratified. A single amendment, Amendment 1, or the amendment, and then just put it all into one, and you either ratify it and take what you get. Congress is specifically not allowed to create rules regarding amendments. I think it even uses the term amendment convention, not amendments, but amendment. And you go, well, do these little things matter? It matters a lot, because the folks who are proposing this have the money and the resources to do exactly what they want done. And I think it's frightening. Bill of Rights. Now, understand that the Bill of Rights in the Constitution are the first 10 amendments. They are not applied, they were considered by the court before the Civil War to not apply to the states. So your freedom of religion did not apply to the state, and the state could do what it thought was appropriate. It's the 14th Amendment that applied the Bill of Rights to the states universally, so that the primacy, the federal power, what's the terminology they use, that the power and jurisdiction of the federal government in regard to those amendments is primary. So if somebody wants to, in the amendment convention, wants to do something with one of the Bill of Rights, they're not able to do it directly. They can do it through changing the 14th Amendment that applies those Bill of Rights to the states. We were considered Supreme Court justices, term limits for Supreme Court justices. Now, that's a dramatic change.